The girls who survive the longest in great houses are the ones no one remembers seeing. Elena Whitmore repeated those words silently as the carriage wheels cracked through frozen mud beneath the black November sky. Rain lashed against the small window beside her, blurring the distant silhouette of Blackmere Hall into something ghost-like and immense. The old driver beside her muttered a prayer under his breath as lightning flickered over the cliffs beyond the estate. Everyone in Northumberland knew the name Ashcombe. Everyone knew the stories whispered about the Duke who lived inside the cold stone mansion overlooking the sea. A man who attended no balls. A man who hosted no guests. A man who had not smiled in nearly 8 years. Elena tightened her fingers around the worn leather strap of her traveling bag. The gloves she owned were too thin for the weather, and she could no longer feel the tips of her fingers. But she said nothing. Girls like her did not complain. Girls like her were hired to disappear quietly into the background of richer people's lives. The carriage finally rolled to a halt before towering iron gates. Blackmere Hall rose beyond them like a fortress carved from storm clouds and shadow. Narrow windows glowed faintly with candlelight behind curtains dark as mourning cloth. Rainwater streamed down the stone walls while sharp winds howled across the empty courtyard. Elena stepped down carefully, her boots sinking into icy gravel. The front doors opened before she reached them, revealing an elderly butler holding a silver lantern. His expression remained perfectly blank as his eyes swept over her modest gray coat and rain-soaked curls. "Miss Whitmore," he said calmly, "you are late." Elena lowered her gaze at once. "The roads flooded near Durham, sir. Excuses are unnecessary here." His voice was not cruel. That somehow made it colder. He stepped aside. "Follow me." Warm air brushed against Elena's face as she entered the hall, though the mansion itself felt strangely lifeless. Massive staircases curved upward beneath dim chandeliers. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following her through flickering shadows. Somewhere deeper inside, the house, a grandfather clock struck midnight with a hollow sound that echoed through the marble corridors like distant thunder. The butler walked slowly ahead of her. "You are to assist with correspondence, records, and household inventories. You will speak only when addressed. You will not wander the east wing. You will not disturb His Grace under any circumstances." Elena nodded softly. "Yes, sir." The old man stopped beside a narrow staircase hidden behind the main hall. "One final thing, Miss Whitmore." For the first time, his pale eyes met hers directly. The previous girls made the mistake of wanting to be noticed. Rain hammered violently against the tall windows overhead. "Do not repeat their mistake." Elena swallowed carefully. "I understand." "Good." He lifted the lantern higher. "Because the Duke notices very little." Her room sat beneath the attic eaves at the far end of a servant's corridor. Small, cold, barely large enough for the iron bed pressed beneath the slanted ceiling. Yet Elena felt relief the moment the door closed behind her. Privacy was a luxury she had not possessed in years. She removed her damp coat slowly and crossed toward the tiny window overlooking the cliffs. Beyond the glass, the Atlantic churned beneath sheets of rain, black waves crashing against jagged rocks nearly 60 feet below the estate. The wind sounded almost human at this height. Elena rested trembling fingers against the windowsill. She had nowhere else to go now. No family, no inheritance, no future beyond survival. Blackmere Hall was not salvation. It was simply the last door still open to her. A floorboard creaked suddenly outside her room. Elena froze. Slow footsteps echoed through the corridor beyond the door. Heavy, measured, unhurried, not servant footsteps. The sound moved past her room, then stopped completely. Silence swallowed the hallway. Elena's breath caught in her throat. For one impossible moment, she felt certain someone was standing directly outside her door listening to her breathe. Then the footsteps continued again. Slow, fading into darkness. Elena did not sleep for hours afterward. And somewhere deep within Blackmere Hall, Duke Lucian. Ashcombe paused beside the library fire with rainwater still glistening on the shoulders of his black coat. Unable to explain why he suddenly could not stop thinking about the frightened girl with storm-gray eyes standing alone beneath the candlelight. His Grace does not tolerate mistakes. The warning followed Elena Whitmore through her second morning at Blackmere Hall like the lingering chill of the storm outside. Dawn had barely touched the cliffs when Mrs. Aldrich, the housekeeper, placed a stack of sealed letters into Elena's arms beside the servants' corridor. The older woman adjusted her dark wool shawl tightly around narrow shoulders while studying Elena with cautious eyes. The Duke's correspondence goes to the West Study every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, she continued. You will leave the letters on the desk and depart immediately. You are not to speak unless spoken to. You are not to stare. And above all else, her expression sharpened slightly. Do not linger. Elena nodded at once. Yes, ma'am. The hallways of Blackmere seemed even larger in daylight. Pale winter light slipped through towering windows, painting silver across marble floors and dark wood paneling polished to perfection. Yet despite the grandeur, the mansion remained strangely silent. No laughter, no music, only the distant ticking of clocks and the faint crackling of fireplaces hidden behind closed doors. Elena carried the letters carefully against her chest, while memorizing every turn the servants had shown her the night before. Left at the portrait gallery, right beneath the staircase, straight through the long corridor lined with black and gold wallpaper faded by time. The West Study doors stood partially open when she arrived. Warm firelight flickered across the floor inside. Elena hesitated only briefly before stepping forward. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood, old paper, and rain carried in from the sea. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling beneath shadowed walls crowded with leather-bound books. A large globe stood near the windows overlooking the cliffs, while a silver watch rested beside an untouched cup of coffee on the massive mahogany desk. Elena lowered her gaze immediately. The Duke was inside. Lucy and Ashcombe stood near the fireplace with one hand resting against the stone mantel. Tall, motionless. The dark fabric of his coat sharpened the broad lines of his shoulders, while morning light cut across the severe angle of his jaw. He appeared older in daylight than she expected. Not old in years, but in weariness. The kind carved slowly into a man by long winters and longer silences. Elena crossed quietly toward the desk, praying her footsteps would disappear beneath the crackling fire. She placed the letters down carefully. One envelope slipped suddenly from the stack. It struck the polished wood and scattered several pages across the floor. The sound seemed unbearably loud in the silent room. Elena's breath caught. I am sorry, Your Grace. She dropped immediately to her knees, gathering the fallen papers with trembling fingers. The fire snapped softly behind her. No answer came. The silence somehow felt worse. Elena rose quickly, keeping her eyes lowered as she placed the final page neatly atop the stack. It will not happen again. She turned to leave. Miss Whitmore. His voice stopped her instantly. Deep, calm, controlled enough to hide whatever lived beneath it. Elena froze beside the door. Yes, Your Grace. Look at me. Her fingers tightened against the fabric of her skirt. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. For the first time, Duke Lucy and Ashcombe looked directly at her without shadow or distance between them. His eyes were not cold exactly. They were observant, sharp enough to notice things most people missed. He studied her face for several long seconds, and Elena suddenly became painfully aware of every detail about herself. The rain damaged hem of her dress, the loose curl beside her cheek, the nervous rise and fall of her breathing. His gaze moved briefly toward her hands. You are freezing. Elena blinked softly, startled by the unexpected remark. It is only the weather, Your Grace. His expression did not change. Yet something unreadable flickered briefly behind his eyes before disappearing again. The west corridors are colder than the rest of the house, he said quietly. The fireplaces. They are unreliable. Elena nodded carefully. I will manage, sir. Another pause settled between them. Heavy. Strange. The Duke glanced back toward the fire at last. See that you do. Elena left the study moments later with her pulse unsteady beneath her ribs. Behind her, Lucy and Ashcombe remained standing beside the fireplace, staring at the closed door long after she had gone. He should have forgotten her immediately. Another quiet girl. Another servant moving through the halls unnoticed. Yet for reasons he did not understand, he could still see the storm-gray color of her eyes as clearly as the sea beyond Blackmere's cliffs. By the third week at Blackmere Hall, Elena Whitmore had learned that silence carried differently inside great houses. In poor homes, silence meant hunger, exhaustion, or grief too deep for words. But inside Blackmere, silence felt watchful. It lingered in the endless corridors beneath dim chandeliers. It drifted through the library whenever the Duke sat beside the fire reading letters he never answered. It followed Elena constantly, like something breathing just behind her shoulder. The first snowfall arrived early that December. Thick white flakes swept across the cliffs and buried the gardens beneath silver frost before noon. Servants hurried through the halls carrying coal and firewood, while the wind rattled against the tall windows hard enough to make the glass tremble. Elena spent most of the afternoon organizing household records beside the west drawing room, her fingers stiff from cold despite the crackling fireplace nearby. She worked quietly, careful not to disturb the guests who had arrived from London the evening before. Blackmere rarely welcomed visitors, but several noble families had come north for a winter hunting party hosted on neighboring estates. Their laughter echoed through the mansion like something foreign and unwelcome. Elena kept her eyes lowered as she crossed the corridor carrying fresh correspondence shortly before dinner. Two elegantly dressed women stood near the staircase wrapped in velvet gowns and pearl jewelry that glimmered beneath candlelight. Their voices softened the moment Elena approached. "Another new one?" one woman asked quietly. "I suppose Ashcombe finally grew tired of the others." The second lady laughed beneath her breath. "She looks frightened enough already." Elena continued walking without reacting. Years ago, such remarks might have embarrassed her. Now they simply reminded her where she belonged. Invisible girls survived by pretending not to hear cruelty spoken directly in front of them. She nearly reached the drawing room when a masculine voice interrupted her path. "You there?" Elena stopped immediately. Lord Percival Montrose leaned carelessly against the doorway with a glass of amber liquor resting between gloved fingers. He was younger than the other noblemen, handsome in the polished way society admired, though something sharp lingered beneath his easy smile. Elena lowered her gaze politely. "My lord." His eyes traveled slowly over her plain gray dress. "You are the Duke's newest little shadow, are you not?" Elena tightened her grip on the letters. "I assist with household records, sir." "How thrilling." His smile widened slightly as several nearby guests turned their attention toward them. "Tell me, does Ashcombe ever speak more than 3 words at a time? Or has the great Duke finally turned entirely to stone?" A few quiet laughs followed. Elena remained still. "I would not know, my lord." "No." He stepped closer. The scent of expensive cologne and whiskey drifted through the air. "You spend enough time near him." Elena's pulse quickened. "Excuse me, sir. I should deliver these before dinner." Lord Montrose reached out suddenly and took one envelope from the stack in her arms. "Such perfect manners," he murmured. "Perhaps Blackmere trains its servants better than London does." More laughter stirred around them. Elena felt heat rise painfully into her cheeks, but forced herself not to react. "Please return the letter, my lord." "Or what?" His voice remained teasing, though his eyes sharpened slightly at her unexpected response. "Will the silent Duke come rushing to defend you?" The corridor grew very still. Elena became aware of footsteps somewhere behind her. Slow. Familiar. Every servant in Blackmere recognized that measured sound instantly. Lord Montrose noticed the silence around him a second too late. Elena turned carefully. Duke Lucian Ashcombe stood several feet away at the end of the corridor, dressed entirely in black evening clothes that seemed to absorb the firelight around him. Snow clung faintly to the shoulders of his coat, as though he had just returned from outside. His expression revealed nothing at all. Yet the atmosphere in the hall changed immediately. The noble guests lowered their voices. Even the servants stopped moving. Lucian's gray eyes shifted once toward the envelope in Lord Montrose's hand before settling calmly on Elena's face. Only for a second, but long enough for her heartbeat to stumble unevenly beneath her ribs. "Lord Montrose," the Duke said quietly, "you are delaying my staff." The younger man released the letter at once with an awkward laugh. "Merely conversation, Ashcombe." Lucian stepped forward slowly. "Then allow me to improve it." His gaze never left Lord Montrose now. "Dinner will begin without anyone who mistakes humiliation for entertainment." The words were calm, controlled, somehow that made them colder than anger. Silence pressed heavily through the corridor. Lord Montrose's smile faded almost imperceptibly before he stepped aside. "Of course." Elena lowered her eyes immediately and moved past them toward the drawing room. Her breathing remained steady only through force of habit. But as she disappeared down the corridor, she could still feel the weight of the Duke's gaze lingering quietly on her back. Snow continued falling over Blackmere Hall for 3 straight days after the dinner party incident, burying the cliffs and surrounding forests beneath thick white silence. By the fourth morning, the entire estate seemed suspended outside time itself. Carriages could no longer reach the main road. The servants moved more quietly than usual, their voices lowered beneath the constant sound of winter wind pressing against the old stone walls. Elena Whitmore welcomed the silence. It allowed her to forget the strange tension lingering beneath every interaction since Lord Montrose's humiliation in the corridor. No one spoke openly about what had happened, yet she noticed the subtle changes immediately. The guests no longer mocked her presence. Several servants now watched her with cautious curiosity when they believed she was not looking. And most unsettling of all, Duke Lucian Ashcombe seemed to appear everywhere without warning. She would sense him before seeing him. A dark figure standing near the library windows while snow drifted outside. The sound of measured footsteps slowing briefly as she passed through the hall. A quiet glance lingering too long before disappearing again. Elena told herself it meant nothing. Men like Lucian Ashcombe did not notice women like her. That was precisely why the feeling unsettled her so deeply. Late that afternoon, Mrs. Aldridge handed Elena a leather-bound ledger beside the servants' staircase. The Duke requires this inventory delivered to the East Wing study. Elena hesitated before she could stop herself. The housekeeper noticed immediately. You know the rules concerning the East Wing? Yes, ma'am. Every servant in Blackmere knew them. The eastern corridors remained locked most nights and rarely used during the day. The staff cleaned only when instructed directly by the Duke himself. No one spoke about why. Mrs. Aldridge adjusted the lace cuffs at her wrists carefully. Leave the ledger on the desk and return immediately. Do not wander. Elena nodded and took the heavy book into her arms. The East Wing felt colder than the rest of the mansion. The fireplaces there had long gone dark, leaving faint traces of frost along the edges of tall windows overlooking the sea. Elena walked carefully beneath dim chandeliers draped in white sheets to protect them from dust. Portraits lined the corridor walls beneath faded candle sconces, their painted faces nearly hidden in shadow. The farther she walked, the quieter the mansion became until only the sound of her own footsteps remained. She finally reached the study door, standing partially open near the end of the corridor. Elena stepped inside carefully and placed the ledger onto a desk coated lightly in dust. The room smelled untouched, preserved beneath years of silence. Her eyes drifted unwillingly toward the objects surrounding her. A silver hairbrush resting beside a cracked porcelain vase. A music box beneath layers of lace cloth. Fresh roses long since dried dark within a crystal vase near the fireplace. It did not feel abandoned exactly. It felt paused, as though someone had left suddenly and never returned. Elena turned to leave when something caught her attention near the far wall. A large portrait stood hidden beneath black fabric, partially loosened at one corner. Before she could stop herself, Elena stepped closer. Pale candlelight revealed part of a woman's painted face beneath the cloth. Soft features, dark hair, eyes filled with quiet warmth. The portrait seemed unfinished somehow, frozen halfway between memory and grief. You should not be here. The voice shattered the silence behind her. Elena spun around immediately, her breath catching painfully in her throat. Duke Lucian Ashcombe stood in the doorway dressed entirely in black, one gloved hand still resting against the doorframe. Elena had not heard him approach. Snowflakes melted slowly against the dark wool of his coat, while cold air drifted inward behind him. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, lowering her gaze. "Mrs. Aldridge asked me to deliver the inventory." Lucian's eyes moved briefly toward the uncovered portrait before returning to Elena's face. His expression remained unreadable. "And yet you lingered." Heat flooded her cheeks at once. "I did not mean to intrude." Silence stretched between them while the wind moaned softly beyond the tall windows. Elena expected anger, expected dismissal. Instead, the Duke stepped slowly into the room and closed the door behind him with quiet finality. "Most people avoid this wing entirely," he said at last. Elena tightened her fingers against the folds of her skirt. "Most people are wiser than I am." Something almost imperceptible shifted in Lucian's expression then. Not amusement exactly, but close enough to unsettle her even more. His gaze lingered on her face for several silent seconds before drifting once again toward the portrait beneath black cloth. Her name was Evelyn, he said quietly. Elena blinked softly, startled by the unexpected confession. The fireless room suddenly felt too still, too intimate. Lucien continued staring at the portrait, as though speaking more to memory than to her. She hated winter. Elena did not know why the sadness in his voice affected her so deeply. Perhaps because it was the first real emotion she had heard from him since arriving at Blackmere Hall. The Duke finally looked back at her then, his gray eyes shadowed by something colder than grief. "You may go, Miss Whitmore." Elena nodded immediately and moved toward the door. Yet as she passed him, she felt his gaze follow her once again with quiet, dangerous intensity. And for the first time since arriving at Blackmere, Elena began to suspect the Duke was no longer merely noticing her. He was beginning to remember her. After the evening in the East Wing, something inside Blackmere Hall shifted so subtly that no one could name it aloud, yet everyone seemed to feel it. The servants spoke more carefully whenever Elena Whitmore entered a room. Mrs. Aldridge began assigning her work closer to the main corridors instead of the hidden servant passages. Even the old butler watched her now with the cautious expression of a man noticing cracks form beneath frozen ice. Elena tried to ignore it all. She focused on her duties, on inventories and correspondence, and the endless stacks of records requiring organization before the year's end. But no matter how carefully she lowered her eyes or softened her footsteps, one truth became impossible to escape. Duke Lucien Ashcombe had started noticing things about her. Small things. Dangerous things. The first time happened during breakfast service 3 mornings later. Snow fell steadily outside the tall dining room windows while pale winter light reflected across silver dishes and untouched crystal glasses. Several guests remained at Blackmere because the roads south were still buried beneath drifts nearly 4 feet deep. Elena entered quietly carrying fresh correspondence for the Duke. Lucien sat at the far end of the massive table dressed in charcoal black, one hand resting beside a cup of coffee gone cold long ago. Lord Montrose spoke loudly about London politics while the others listened. With practiced interest, Elena crossed silently toward the Duke's chair and placed the letters beside him. She turned to leave immediately. "Miss Whitmore." Her pulse tightened. "Yes, Your Grace." Lucien glanced once toward the untouched tray near the servants' entrance. "You did not eat breakfast." The entire table fell strangely quiet. Elena felt heat rise beneath her skin. "I was not hungry, sir." His gray eyes lingered on her face briefly, too briefly for anyone else to question it, yet long enough to make her chest tighten unexpectedly. "You should not work through meals," he said calmly before returning his attention to the letters. Lord Montrose looked between them with visible curiosity while Elena stood frozen for half a second longer than propriety allowed. "Yes, Your Grace." She escaped the room immediately afterward, though the strange weight in her chest followed her all morning. The second time happened that same evening. Blackmere's western corridors became unbearably cold after sunset, whenever sea winds swept through the cliffs. Elena sat alone in the records room organizing estate accounts beneath dim candlelight, her fingers trembling slightly from the cold as she copied figures into a ledger. She had not realized how late it had become until the door opened quietly behind her. Elena stood at once. Lucien Ashcombe entered carrying several folded documents beneath one arm. Snow dusted the shoulders of his dark coat once again. "Your Grace." His gaze shifted immediately toward her hands resting against the desk. "You are freezing again." Elena instinctively folded her fingers together. "The fire burned low, sir." Lucien crossed the room without another word. Elena watched silently as he knelt beside the fireplace and added fresh logs himself rather than summoning servants. Flames slowly rose higher, spilling gold across the dark walls and sharpening the severe lines of his face. The gesture should not have unsettled her so deeply. Yet no man of his position should have noticed such a detail at all. Lucien rose slowly. "The west corridors are always cold after midnight." Elena blinked softly. "I did not realize it was so late." His eyes settled on the clock above the mantel. Most people do not lose track of time in silence. The words carried no mockery. Somehow that made them more dangerous. Elena lowered her gaze carefully. "Silence is familiar to me, sir." Something unreadable flickered behind Lucien's expression then. He studied her for several long seconds while firelight moved softly across the room between them. That is not always a kindness. Elena did not know how to answer. The Duke looked away first. Yet before leaving the room, he paused beside the doorway without turning back toward her. Mrs. Aldridge will have a heavier coat brought to your room tomorrow. Elena's breath caught slightly. That is unnecessary, Your Grace. Nevertheless, his voice remained calm. Final. Then he disappeared into the dark corridor beyond the records room, leaving only the fading sound of his footsteps behind. Elena stared at the fire for a very long time afterward. Somewhere deep beneath Blackmere Hall, the old grandfather clock struck midnight into the silence. And for the first time since arriving at the estate, Elena Whitmore began to understand something deeply unsettling. Duke Lucien Ashcombe was not simply observing her anymore. He was remembering her absence whenever she was gone. The storm arrived just after sunset with enough force to shake the windows of Blackmere Hall. Snow lashed against the cliffs in violent white spirals while freezing winds screamed through the narrow stone passages like voices trapped inside the walls. By midnight, the servants had extinguished most of the chandeliers to conserve oil, leaving the mansion draped in flickering shadows and candlelight. Elena Whitmore sat alone in the library, sorting estate correspondence beside the fire while thunder rolled somewhere over the sea. The warmth should have comforted her. Instead, unease lingered beneath her skin all evening. Blackmere felt different during storms. More isolated. More alive somehow. The grandfather clock struck 12 slowly across the hall when the lights suddenly vanished. The entire room plunged into darkness. Elena startled at once as the fire snapped sharply in the silence. Somewhere deep within the mansion, servants called out in confusion. Then the sound of distant doors slamming echoed through the corridors as the storm swallowed everything again. Elena rose carefully from the desk, her pulse uneven beneath her ribs. Blackmere rarely lost power completely. The sea winds must have damaged the western generator near the cliffs. She reached for the nearest candle just as the library doors opened behind her. Lucien Ashcombe stepped inside, carrying a lantern that painted warm gold across the dark room. Snow clung to his black coat and dark hair, partially melted by the heat from the fire. "Do not move," he said quietly. "The east corridor staircase collapsed an hour ago. Half the servants are searching for safer passages." Elena immediately lowered the candle. Was anyone injured? No, his voice remained calm as always. The storm warning came early enough. He crossed toward the fireplace and placed the lantern onto the mantel. Shadows shifted softly across his face beneath the low amber light. Elena realized suddenly how alone they were. The storm outside swallowed every sound beyond the library walls. "Mrs. Aldridge asked me to finish organizing the ledgers tonight," she explained softly. Lucien glanced toward the papers scattered across the desk. "You follow instructions very faithfully." Elena folded her hands carefully before her. "That is what I was hired to do, Your Grace." Something in her answer caused his expression to shift almost imperceptibly. The Duke removed his gloves slowly and set them beside the lantern. "And if the instructions are unreasonable?" Elena looked down at the fire. "Then I complete them quietly." Silence settled heavily between them once again. The storm rattled violently against the tall windows while snow swept across the cliffs beyond the glass in endless white waves. Lucien remained standing near the fireplace, watching her with that same unreadable intensity she had begun noticing everywhere lately. Not cold, not cruel, worse, curious. Elena moved toward the shelves to steady herself with work, but the dim candlelight made reading nearly impossible. "You should sit closer to the fire," Lucien said after several moments. "You are." Shivering again. Elena had not realized he noticed. She stepped nearer reluctantly, careful to keep distance between them. The firelight softened the severe lines of the Duke's face, making him appear less untouchable than usual. More tired, more human. Outside, thunder cracked sharply enough to shake the windows. Elena flinched before she could stop herself. Lucien noticed immediately. "You dislike storms." "Not storms," she answered quietly. "Only the feeling of being trapped during them." His eyes rested on her face. "You speak as though you have experienced it before." Elena hesitated. Most people at Blackmere never asked questions about her past, perhaps because servants were not expected to possess one worth hearing. Yet something about the darkness surrounding them now felt strangely confessional. My father died during a winter storm when I was 14, she admitted softly. The roads flooded for 3 days afterward. No one could reach us. The fire crackled quietly between them. Lucien did not interrupt. After that, Elena continued, everything became smaller, quieter. People stopped expecting much from me. Her fingers tightened together. Eventually, I learned it was easier to disappear before anyone could decide I was a burden. The words escaped more honestly than she intended. Shame warmed her cheeks instantly afterward. She stared down at the flames. Forgive me. I should not have said that. But Lucien Ashcombe said nothing for several long seconds. Elena slowly lifted her eyes and found him already watching her. Really watching her. The storm outside seemed to fade entirely beneath the weight of his gaze. Invisible people, he said at last, his voice lower now, quieter somehow, often notice things everyone else misses. Elena's breath caught slightly. Lucien stepped closer to the fire then, though still not close enough to touch her. Tell me something honestly, Miss Whitmore. His gray eyes held her steadily. When you arrived at Blackmere Hall, were you planning to survive here? The question unsettled her more than it should have. Because for the first time since arriving at the estate, Elena realized the Duke was not asking about employment. He was asking about her. The storm finally passed 2 days later, but the strange tension inside Blackmere Hall did not leave with it. If anything, the silence afterward felt heavier, more dangerous. Elena Whitmore noticed it the moment the household returned to its usual rhythm. Servants resumed polishing silver and preparing guest rooms. Carriages once again appeared along the snow-covered drive. Laughter drifted through the drawing rooms as the remaining noble guests celebrated the clearing weather with music and expensive wine. Yet beneath the polished surface of Blackmere, something had changed. Elena could feel it every time Duke Lucien Ashcombe entered a room. He no longer looked through her as though she belonged to the walls themselves. Now he looked directly at her. Briefly, quietly, but with enough intensity to leave her unsettled long after he turned away. By Saturday evening, Blackmere hosted its first formal dinner since the storm. Candlelight flooded the grand ballroom, while musicians played soft waltzes near the marble staircase. Ladies moved through the room in silk and velvet gowns shimmering beneath crystal chandeliers. The scent of roses, wine, and burning cedarwood filled the warm air. Elena remained near the edges of the ballroom, assisting Mrs. Aldridge with seating arrangements and correspondence for arriving guests. Invisible. Safe. Exactly where she belonged. Or at least that was what she tried to believe. Lord Percival Montrose had clearly not forgotten his previous humiliation. Elena noticed him watching her twice before dinner even began, his polished smile never quite reaching his eyes. She avoided him carefully throughout the evening, focusing on her duties while the orchestra drifted softly through the ballroom. Halfway through the second course, Mrs. Aldridge quietly instructed Elena to deliver a message to one of the visiting countesses seated near the center of the hall. Elena obeyed immediately, crossing between tables beneath the glow of candlelight. Conversations lowered slightly as she passed. She kept her eyes down, calm, controlled. But just as she reached the countess, Lord Montrose suddenly stepped into her path once again. Miss Whitmore, he said smoothly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Elena stopped immediately. My lord. His gaze drifted over her simple dark dress before returning to her face. You move through this house like a ghost. A few guests exchanged amused glances. Elena tightened her fingers around the folded note in her hand. Excuse me, sir. I should deliver this message. Always working. He smiled faintly. Ashcombe keeps you very close these days. Heat crept painfully into Elena's cheeks. Several nearby ladies looked up now with open curiosity. You misunderstand, my lord. Do I? Lord Montrose stepped slightly closer. The Duke has barely spoken to anyone all evening, yet he notices every time you leave the room. A low murmur spread quietly through the surrounding tables. Elena's pulse stumbled unevenly. Please move aside. Or perhaps, Montrose continued carelessly, you simply discovered the fastest way to earn a duke's attention. The words landed harder than laughter would have. Elena felt the humiliation immediately, not because she believed him, but because everyone else might. In houses like Blackmere, rumors destroyed women long before truth ever arrived to defend them. She lowered her gaze at once. I have done nothing improper. Lord Montrose gave a soft, mocking smile. Of course not. The orchestra continued playing somewhere behind them. Yet the ballroom itself had gone strangely quiet. Elena became aware of it slowly. One conversation after another fading into silence. One by one, heads turning toward the far end of the room. Lord Montrose noticed too late. Lucian Ashcombe stood beside the staircase beneath the chandelier light, one hand resting loosely behind his back. Black formal attire sharpened every severe line of his tall figure, while shadows flickered across his gray eyes. He had clearly heard enough. The Duke crossed the ballroom slowly. Calmly. The crowd parted almost instinctively before him. Elena's heartbeat quickened with every measured step he took toward them. Lucian stopped beside her without looking at Lord Montrose immediately. Instead, his gaze settled first on Elena's face. Quiet. Searching. As though checking for something invisible. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "why are you not seated?" The question confused her completely. "Your Grace. You have been working since dawn." His voice remained calm enough to make the silence around them unbearable. "You were instructed to rest after dinner." Elena stared at him speechlessly for half a second. She had received no such instruction. Lucian finally turned toward Lord Montrose then. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop instantly. "You appear deeply interested in the routines of my household staff," the Duke said quietly. Lord Montrose forced a shallow laugh. "Merely conversation, Ashcombe." No, Lucian's voice remained perfectly controlled. Conversation requires intelligence from both participants. Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. Elena felt her breath catch softly. The Duke stepped slightly closer now, his expression unreadable beneath the chandelier light. "Miss Whitmore is under my protection while she resides at Blackmere Hall." Every word landed with cold precision. "Anyone who finds amusement in embarrassing her will leave this estate immediately." Complete silence followed. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. Elena could feel dozens of eyes fixed upon her, yet somehow the only gaze she truly felt was Lucian's. Calm, intense, dangerous in ways she did not yet understand. And as the Duke finally offered her his arm before the entire ballroom, Elena Whitmore realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that Blackmere Hall was no longer allowing her to disappear. After the ballroom incident, Blackmere Hall no longer felt merely watchful to Elena Whitmore. It felt aware. The change revealed itself in quiet ways at first. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Servants glanced toward her before lowering their eyes too quickly. One of the younger maids even curtsied nervously while handing Elena fresh linens the following morning, as though uncertain what position she now occupied within the house. Elena hated it immediately. Attention inside great estates was never safe for women like her, especially attention from powerful men, especially attention from men like Lucian Ashcombe. Yet avoiding him became impossible. Everywhere she turned, the Duke seemed to appear, not always beside her, sometimes only in reflections, across long corridors, at the edge of crowded rooms, watching quietly from shadows and candlelight with that same unreadable expression that unsettled her more each day. Elena first noticed it during breakfast 3 mornings after the dinner party. Snow still covered the cliffs outside Blackmere Hall, though pale sunlight now broke occasionally through the heavy winter clouds. Elena stood near the library doorway, organizing estate invoices, while several guests gathered around the fire discussing plans to finally leave once the roads reopened fully. Lord Montrose had departed early the previous evening, without farewell. No one mentioned his absence directly, though whispers moved through the house afterward like smoke. Elena kept her attention fixed firmly on the papers in her hands. Then she felt it. That strange awareness again. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the far side of the room. Lucian Ashcombe stood beside the window speaking with a visiting baron. Yet despite the conversation, despite the crowded room around him, his gaze rested directly on her. Not accidentally. Intentionally. Elena's breath caught softly. The Duke looked away only after several long seconds, though the uneasy warmth remained beneath her skin long afterward. The second time happened later that afternoon in the music room. Elena had been sent to retrieve correspondence left near the piano after the previous evening's gathering. Dust floated through pale sunlight, spilling across the dark polished floor, while silence settled softly over the empty room. She crossed toward the piano carefully and gathered the forgotten papers. A movement in the reflection of the nearby mirror made her freeze. Lucian stood in the hallway outside the open doorway. watching her. He had likely been there several moments already. Elena turned immediately. Your Grace. The Duke stepped slowly into the room, one hand resting behind his back. You play? Elena glanced toward the piano uncertainly. No, sir. His gray eyes moved briefly toward the yellowed sheet music scattered across the instrument. You looked at it as though you recognized the piece. Elena hesitated. My mother played sometimes when I was young. Something softened faintly behind his expression. And you never learned? There was never time after she died. Silence stretched gently between them beneath the fading winter light. Elena lowered her gaze once more. I should return these to the study. Lucien did not move aside immediately. Miss Whitmore. She looked up carefully. The Duke's voice remained calm, yet quieter now somehow. More personal. Are you afraid of me? The question unsettled her enough that she answered honestly before caution could stop her. I do not know. Lucien stared at her for several silent seconds. Most people decide much faster. Elena tightened her fingers around the papers. Most people know where they stand with you, Your Grace. Something unreadable flickered across his face then. Not anger. Something deeper. More dangerous. And you do not. Elena's pulse quickened painfully beneath her ribs. Because the truth was becoming impossible to deny. She no longer understood what Lucien Ashcombe wanted from her, or why his attention followed her through Blackmere Hall like shadowed firelight. Before she could answer, footsteps echoed suddenly through the corridor outside. Mrs. Aldridge appeared moments later carrying fresh linens for the music room. Her sharp eyes moved quickly between them. Elena stepped back immediately. I should return to work. Lucien gave a single slow nod and moved aside at last. Yet as Elena passed him, she felt his gaze linger once again with unbearable intensity. Calm, observant, almost possessive in ways that frightened her deeply. That night Elena stood alone beside the small attic window in her room, watching snow drift across the cliffs beneath moonlight. Blackmere Hall slept quietly beneath her. Somewhere below, the grandfather clock struck 1 in the morning. Elena closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady the unease tightening inside her chest. Then she heard it. Slow footsteps moving through the corridor outside her door. Familiar footsteps. They stopped directly beyond the wall. Once again, silence followed. Heavy, breathing silence. Elena's heartbeat stumbled unevenly as she stared toward the dark doorway of her room. And somewhere on the opposite side of that thin wooden door, Duke Lucien Ashcombe remained standing perfectly still in the darkness. Elena Whitmore slept very little after hearing the Duke's footsteps outside her door. By morning she convinced herself she must have imagined the entire thing. Blackmere Hall had a way of turning silence into something alive after midnight. Old houses breathed differently in winter. Floorboards shifted. Pipes groaned behind stone walls. Storm winds carried strange echoes through empty corridors. Yet deep down, Elena knew the footsteps had been real. And even more frightening was the certainty that Lucien Ashcombe had stood there for reasons neither of them fully understood. The following days passed beneath heavy gray skies and endless snowfall drifting across the cliffs. Most of the guests finally departed once the southern roads reopened, leaving Blackmere quieter than before. Elena welcomed the emptiness. Fewer eyes meant fewer whispers. Yet despite the silence returning to the estate, she could still feel the Duke's attention following her everywhere. Not openly, never carelessly. Lucien Ashcombe remained far too controlled for that. But she noticed the details now. He always seemed aware of which room she occupied, which corridor she used, whether she had eaten, whether she looked tired. It should have frightened her enough to leave. Instead, something far more dangerous was happening. She had started noticing him too. Late one snowy afternoon, Mrs. Aldridge instructed Elena to organize several unopened crates recently moved from the East Wing storage rooms. The Duke wants old correspondence cataloged before the new year, the housekeeper explained while handing her a brass key. Most of the boxes belonged to the former mistress of Blackmere. Elena hesitated slightly. Miss Evelyn? Mrs. Aldridge's expression sharpened at once. The staff does not speak her name lightly. Elena lowered her gaze immediately. Forgive me. The older woman sighed quietly after a moment. Just finish. Before evening. Elena carried the lantern herself through the dim East Wing corridors an hour later. Dust floated through cold shafts of fading winter light, while silence settled heavily over the abandoned rooms. She unlocked the old sitting room near the portrait gallery and stepped inside carefully. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and old paper untouched for years. Several wooden crates sat near the fireplace covered in pale dust. Elena knelt beside the first box and slowly lifted the lid. Letters tied with silver ribbon rested neatly inside alongside dried flowers and faded sheet music. Most were harmless enough. Invitations, estate records, holiday cards from noble families long forgotten. Elena worked quietly for nearly an hour while snow drifted softly beyond the tall windows. Then she found the smaller box hidden beneath the others. No label marked the lid. Only a delicate gold clasp shaped like a rose. Something about it felt personal immediately. Elena should not have opened it. She knew that. Yet curiosity stirred before caution could stop it. Inside rested several folded letters written in elegant feminine handwriting. A silver pocket watch. And beneath them all, a leather journal worn gently at the corners. Elena hesitated before opening it carefully. The first pages contained harmless observations about Blackmere Hall, winter parties, music performances, favorite books. But as Elena turned farther through the journal, the tone slowly changed. The handwriting grew heavier somehow. Sadder. One particular entry near the center caught her attention immediately. Lucien notices silence before he notices beauty. That is what frightens me most about him. He watches people the way storms watch the sea. Quietly, patiently, as though waiting for something to break. Elena's breath slowed. She continued reading despite the growing unease beneath her ribs. Everyone believes he is cold because he does not love deeply. They are wrong. Lucien loves too deeply. That is why he buries it beneath silence until nothing survives near him for long. The fireless room suddenly felt colder. Elena lowered the journal slowly into her lap. For the first time since arriving at Blackmere Hall, she began to understand something painfully human beneath Lucien Ashcombe's careful control. He was not empty. He was terrified. A floorboard creaked softly behind her. Elena's pulse stumbled instantly. She turned too quickly, the journal slipping slightly from her hands. Lucien stood in the doorway, watching her silently beneath the low lantern light. Snow darkened the shoulders of his black coat, once again, while shadows hollowed the sharp lines of his face. Neither of them spoke immediately. Elena rose too quickly, clutching the journal against her chest. "Your Grace, I apologize. I should not have opened this." Lucien's eyes lowered briefly toward the leather cover in her trembling hands. Something unreadable flickered behind his expression. Not anger. Worse, vulnerability. "Most people avoid those rooms entirely," he said quietly. Elena swallowed carefully. "I did not mean to intrude." Silence stretched between them beneath the sound of distant winter wind. Then Lucien stepped farther into the room, his gray eyes never leaving her face. "And yet," he said softly, "you keep finding the parts of me no one else notices." Elena's breath caught painfully at the words, because deep down, she feared he was beginning to do exactly the same thing to her. For the first time since arriving at Blackmere Hall, Elena Whitmore began considering escape. The thought unsettled her deeply because it arrived not from fear of the house itself, but from fear of what staying there was slowly doing to her heart. She understood now that Duke Lucien Ashcombe was not merely lonely. Loneliness could be survived. What lived inside him felt far more dangerous than that. It was the quiet desperation of a man who had buried every emotion so deeply that even the smallest warmth threatened to break him apart. And somehow, against all reason, he had started turning that unbearable attention toward her. The realization followed Elena everywhere after the discovery in the East Wing. She noticed it in the silence that settled whenever Lucien entered a room and found her already there. In the way his gaze instinctively searched for her during meals before he spoke to anyone else. In the strange moments where he seemed on the verge of saying something honest before pulling himself cold again at the last second. It could not continue. Women like Elena did not survive becoming emotionally important to powerful men, especially damaged ones, especially grieving ones. 3 nights later, snow fell gently beyond the windows while Blackmere Hall rested beneath heavy winter silence. Elena sat alone in her attic room folding the few dresses she owned into her traveling trunk. The sight of it made her chest ache unexpectedly. She had not realized until now how familiar Blackmere had become to her. The sound of distant clocks at midnight. The smell of cedarwood fires drifting through old corridors. The strange comfort of seeing candlelight beneath the Duke's study door long after everyone else slept. Elena closed the trunk quickly before emotion could weaken her resolve. Leaving quietly was the only safe choice remaining. She had already written a short letter of resignation earlier that evening. Simple, respectful, grateful for the opportunity. She planned to depart before dawn once the southern carriage routes reopened fully. No scenes, no explanations. Invisible girls survived by disappearing before they became necessary to anyone. A sharp knock interrupted the silence suddenly. Elena froze beside the bed. No one visited servant quarters this late at night. Another knock followed. Calm, controlled, familiar. Her heartbeat stumbled painfully beneath her ribs. Miss Whitmore. Lucian Ashcombe's voice carried softly through the door. Elena stared toward the dark wood in silence for one terrible moment before forcing herself to move. She opened the door slowly. The Duke stood alone beneath the dim corridor candlelight, dressed entirely in black, one gloved hand resting loosely at his side. Snow melted faintly against the shoulders of his coat, as though he had just returned from outside. His gray eyes moved past her immediately, toward the open trunk beside the bed. The atmosphere changed instantly. Elena felt it before either of them spoke. Lucian stepped into the room slowly, his expression unreadable now in the low light. You are leaving? It was not a question. Elena folded her hands tightly before her. I thought it best, Your Grace. Silence pressed heavily against the small attic walls. Lucian glanced once more toward the folded dresses inside the trunk. Best for whom? Elena struggled to steady her breathing. For everyone. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Explain that. She looked down quickly. People are already speaking. People always speak. Not about you. The words escaped too honestly. Elena swallowed hard afterward. Not like this. Lucian remained perfectly still for several seconds. Then he removed one glove slowly, deliberately, as though controlling something beneath his calm exterior required effort now. You believe I care about gossip? Elena finally looked at him then. Really looked at him. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. The dangerous restraint holding every emotion tightly beneath the surface. No, she whispered softly. That is exactly what frightens me. Something cracked behind Lucian's expression at those words. Tiny, barely visible, yet enough to make Elena's pulse quicken painfully. He stepped closer then, slowly enough to allow her time to retreat. She did not move. You think leaving will solve this? His voice had lowered now, rougher somehow beneath the calm. Elena's throat tightened. I think staying will destroy me. The confession hung between them in the dim attic room like fragile glass. Lucian stared at her in complete silence afterward. Then his eyes shifted once more toward the packed trunk beside the bed. For the first time since Elena had known him, real emotion moved openly across the Duke's face. Not anger, not coldness, fear, pure and unmistakable. His voice became almost dangerously quiet. Do not leave Blackmere tomorrow. Elena's breath caught softly. Your Grace, do not leave. The words landed harder this time, not as an order, as something far worse. A plea from a man too proud to beg properly. Silence swallowed the room completely. And as Elena stood frozen beneath the candlelight staring into Lucian Ashcombe's shadowed gray eyes, she realized with sudden terrifying clarity that the Duke was no longer afraid of losing control. He was afraid of losing her. Elena Whitmore did not sleep after Lucian Ashcombe left her room that night. Long after his footsteps disappeared into the silence of Blackmere Hall, she remained standing beside the packed trunk beneath the dim attic candlelight, her hands trembling against the edge of the bed. The Duke's final words continued echoing through her chest with dangerous clarity. Do not leave. Not commanded. Not demanded. Feared. And somehow that frightened her more than anger ever could. Because Elena had spent most of her life learning how to survive cruelty. She did not know how to survive being needed. Dawn arrived pale and colorless beyond the frost-covered windows. Blackmere Hall remained quiet beneath layers of winter snow, while servants slowly prepared the house for mourning. Elena dressed carefully in the simplest dark wool gown she owned and closed the traveling trunk before the rising sun fully touched the cliffs. She had made her decision during the final hours of night. Leaving now was the only kindness she still knew how to offer him. Lucian Ashcombe deserved someone untouched by grief and silence. Someone capable of standing openly beside a duke without fear. Elena was not that woman. She left the resignation letter neatly folded upon the small desk in her room. Then, before courage could fail her, she carried her bag quietly through the sleeping corridors of Blackmere Hall. The grandfather clock struck 6 as she reached the front entrance. Snow drifted gently across the estate beneath a gray winter sky, while a hired carriage waited beyond the gates. Elena stepped outside without looking back. The freezing air stung her cheeks instantly. Good, she thought painfully. Coldness was easier to survive than hope. The carriage driver loaded her trunk silently, while Elena pulled her coat tighter around herself. Blackmere Hall towered behind her against the cliffs, immense and shadowed beneath the pale dawn light. For one dangerous moment, she almost turned around, almost ran back inside before it became too late. Then the front doors of the mansion opened violently behind her. Elena froze instantly. Lucian Ashcombe descended the stone steps with frightening speed, snow swirling around the dark shape of his coat as though the storm itself followed him. He had clearly dressed in haste. His gloves were missing. The collar of his black overcoat remained partially unfastened against the brutal cold. Yet none of that unsettled Elena as much as his expression. The Duke no longer looked calm. He looked terrified. "Stop the carriage." His voice cut sharply through the freezing morning air. The driver obeyed immediately. Elena's pulse stumbled painfully beneath her ribs as Lucian crossed the snow-covered courtyard toward her. He stopped only a few feet away, his breathing uneven for the first time she had ever witnessed. Snow melted slowly against his dark hair, while his gray eyes searched her face with raw desperation no longer hidden beneath silence. "You were going to leave without speaking to me." Elena tightened her fingers around the strap of her bag. It was better this way. For whom? The question came instantly, sharply. Elena struggled to steady herself beneath the intensity of his gaze. "Your Grace, people are already talking. They will continue talking. Eventually they will turn cruel." Lucian stepped closer. "Let them. You do not understand." Her voice trembled despite herself. "I cannot become another ghost inside this house." Something fractured visibly behind his expression then. "You are not a ghost." The words landed almost harshly with emotion. Elena lowered her eyes quickly because hearing him say them hurt too much. "You think you want me here now," she whispered softly. "But grief changes people. One day you will wake up and realize I only reminded you how lonely you already were." Silence followed. Snow drifted quietly between them while the sea crashed somewhere far below the cliffs. Then Lucian Ashcombe did something Elena never expected. He reached for her hand. Carefully, as though afraid she might disappear before he touched her. His fingers closed gently around hers, cold from the winter air. Elena's breath caught instantly. The Duke lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "Do you know what I realized the night you arrived at Blackmere?" Elena could not answer. Lucian's gray eyes never left her face. "For years, I walked through these halls without noticing whether they were empty." His hand tightened slightly around hers. "Then one night, I heard your footsteps stop outside the library door, and suddenly silence became unbearable again." Elena felt tears burn painfully behind her eyes. Lucian stepped closer still, snow gathering across the shoulders of both their coats now. "You were wrong about one thing, Miss Whitmore." His voice roughened softly beneath the winter wind. "You are not reminding me how lonely I am." His thumb brushed once against her frozen knuckles with heartbreaking gentleness. "You are reminding me I do not want to be lonely anymore." Elena Whitmore could not remember later how long they stood together in the snow outside Blackmere Hall. Time seemed to disappear beneath the sound of winter wind and the quiet desperation in Lucian Ashcombe's voice. His hand still held hers gently, as though releasing her now might destroy something fragile beyond repair. The carriage driver waited awkwardly near the gates with lowered eyes, pretending not to witness the impossible scene unfolding before him. A duke did not beg women to stay, especially not women like Elena. Yet Lucian looked at her as though losing her frightened him more than loneliness ever had. "Your Grace," Elena whispered softly, struggling to steady her breathing. "You do not understand what you are asking." Lucian stepped closer through the falling snow. "Then explain it to me." The pain in his voice nearly shattered her resolve. Elena lowered her gaze because looking directly at him hurt too much now. "You see me differently because I arrived during a difficult winter." Her throat tightened painfully. "But winters end." People change. Grief returns. Lucien's fingers closed slightly tighter around hers. And if I do not want this winter to end. Elena finally looked up at him then. Truly looked at him. The powerful duke feared by half of Northumberland stood before her now, with snow gathering across his dark coat, and emotion breaking openly through the careful restraint he had hidden behind for years. He no longer looked untouchable. He looked heartbreakingly human. A sharp wind swept suddenly across the cliffs, forcing Elena to close her eyes briefly against the cold. Lucien glanced immediately toward the darkening sky. More storm clouds gathered beyond the sea faster than expected. Come inside, he said quietly. Elena hesitated. Lucien. The sound of his name spoken softly from her lips changed something instantly between them. His expression shifted almost painfully. Please, he whispered. Not your grace. Not Miss Whitmore. Just please. And somehow that single word undid the last fragile piece of resistance Elena still possessed. An hour later, snow once again hammered violently against Blackmere Hall, while thunder rolled over the cliffs beyond the windows. The second storm arrived harder than the first. Fiercer somehow. Elena sat quietly beside the library fire wrapped in a heavy wool blanket Mrs. Aldridge had brought without comment. The old housekeeper had looked at Lucien only once before silently dismissing every servant from the room. Neither Elena nor the Duke had spoken much since returning inside. Too many truths lingered between them now. Too much had already been said beneath the snow. Lucien stood near the tall library windows watching the storm in silence, one hand resting against the dark wood frame. Firelight flickered softly across the sharp lines of his face, while shadows moved through his gray eyes. Elena studied him quietly from the chair beside the fire. Strange how different he appeared now that she understood him. Not cold. Never truly cold. Just exhausted from carrying grief alone for too long. Evelyn once told me, I watched storms the way other men watched battlefields. Lucien's voice broke the silence unexpectedly. Elena looked up immediately. He still faced the windows. She said I was always waiting for destruction before I allowed myself to care about anything. Snow crashed violently against the glass behind him. Elena folded the blanket tighter around herself. Was she right? Lucien gave a faint, humorless smile. At the time, I believed she was wrong. Slowly, he turned toward her then. The firelight softened something within his expression she had never seen before. Vulnerability without armor. Now I think she understood me better than I understood myself. Elena's chest tightened painfully. Lucien crossed the room slowly and stopped beside the chair where she sat. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt frightening between them. It felt intimate, fragile, real. Why me? Elena asked softly at last. The question had haunted her for weeks now. Lucien looked down at her with quiet intensity. Because you never tried to impress me. His voice remained low beneath the storm outside. You never wanted anything from me. Not power. Not protection. Not status. His eyes moved slowly across her face as though memorizing something precious. You simply existed beside me without asking me to become someone easier to love. Elena felt tears sting behind her eyes instantly. Lucien lowered himself carefully to one knee before her chair then, bringing them nearly level beneath the golden firelight. The gesture shocked her more than any declaration possibly could. Powerful men did not kneel for invisible girls. Yet there he was, looking at her as though she mattered more than his pride. Do you know what frightened me most after you arrived at Blackmere? He asked quietly. Elena could barely breathe now. Lucien's gray eyes never left hers. You looked at me the way people look at abandoned houses. His thumb brushed gently against the edge of the blanket wrapped around her hands. Not with fear, with sadness. The storm raged violently beyond the library windows while silence settled warmly around them. Then Lucien Ashcombe finally spoke the truth both of them had been avoiding for far too long. I think I started loving you the first night I realized I could hear your footsteps disappearing down the hallway, and hated the sound of you leaving. Winter finally loosened its grip on Blackmere Hall in early March. The endless snow covering the cliffs began to melt beneath pale morning sunlight, while dark waves crashed gently against the rocks below the estate once more. For the first time in months, the gardens showed signs of life returning beneath the frost. Servants opened long-sealed windows to let fresh sea air drift through the ancient corridors. Chandeliers no longer felt heavy with shadow. Even the silence inside Blackmere had changed. It no longer sounded lonely. Elena Whitmore noticed the difference most clearly in Lucian Ashcombe himself. The Duke still carried quietness the way other men carried titles. Yet the cold distance surrounding him had slowly disappeared during the passing weeks, replaced by something softer hidden carefully beneath his reserved nature. He smiled now sometimes. Rarely, briefly, but enough to leave entire rooms speechless afterward. The servants whispered constantly about the transformation. Mrs. Aldrich pretended not to notice. The old butler simply looked relieved. Elena moved through Blackmere differently now too. Not proudly, never carelessly, but no longer like someone preparing to vanish at any moment. She still organized correspondence in the West Study and kept records beside the library fire late into the evenings. Yet she no longer lowered her eyes immediately whenever Lucian entered the room, and the Duke no longer pretended not to search for her first everywhere he went. One rainy afternoon, near the beginning of spring, Blackmere hosted its first formal gathering since winter ended. Several neighboring noble families arrived for dinner beneath warm candlelight, and the scent of fresh roses newly placed throughout the ballroom. Elena stood quietly beside the staircase reviewing seating arrangements while servants hurried through the hall preparing wine and music. She wore a simple dark blue gown Mrs. Aldrich herself had insisted upon earlier that morning. Nothing extravagant. Yet Elena still felt painfully aware of every curious glance drifting toward her from the arriving guests. They all knew the rumors now, that the Duke of Blackmere had changed because of a quiet young woman no one noticed until he began noticing her too much. Elena tried not to let it unsettle her. Then Lucian entered the ballroom. Conversation softened instantly around the room, as always. Yet tonight the Duke did not move immediately toward his guests or advisors, or the older lords waiting near the fire. His gray eyes searched the ballroom, only once before finding Elena beside the staircase. And just like every other time lately, the entire atmosphere around him changed the moment he saw her. Warmer somehow, more alive. Elena felt her heartbeat quicken beneath the weight of his gaze. Lucian crossed the ballroom slowly through candlelight and music while dozens of guests discreetly watched. He stopped before her without speaking immediately. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt understood. "You should not stand alone all evening," he said softly. Elena lowered her voice carefully. "I am working, Your Grace." A faint smile touched his mouth then. Small, real, dangerous to her heart every single time. "You are always working." Before Elena could answer, a visiting countess approached with visible curiosity brightening her expression. "Your Grace." The woman greeted smoothly before glancing toward Elena. "Will Miss Whitmore be joining the staff for dinner service tonight?" The question sounded polite enough, but everyone nearby heard the meaning beneath it. What exactly was Elena Whitmore now? Servant? Companion? Scandal? Silence spread carefully through the ballroom, while nearby guests pretended not to listen. Elena felt old instincts rise immediately inside her chest. "Lower your eyes. Step back. Disappear before humiliation arrives." But before she could retreat, Lucian Ashcombe calmly extended his hand toward her in front of the entire room. The gesture stunned the ballroom into complete silence. Elena stared at him in shock for half a second. His gray eyes held hers steadily. "Certain, unafraid. Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "will dine beside me this evening." No hesitation. No apology. The Countess blinked speechlessly while whispers spread instantly through the hall. Yet Lucian never looked away from Elena. Slowly, almost trembling, she placed her hand in his. Warmth closed gently around her fingers. The Duke guided her forward beside him toward the center of the ballroom beneath hundreds of watching eyes. But for the first time in her life, Elena Whitmore did not feel invisible. She felt seen, completely, and somehow still safe. Lucian leaned slightly closer as music drifted softly through the candlelit hall around them. His voice lowered enough for only her to hear. "Do you remember what you told me the night we met?" Elena glanced up at him carefully. Lucian's expression softened with quiet emotion. "You said some people are born only to disappear." His thumb brushed gently against the back of her hand once beneath the ballroom light. "You were wrong." Elena felt tears sting her eyes instantly. Lucian Ashcombe looked at her, then not as a duke observing a servant, but as a man who had finally found the one person capable of reaching the parts of him buried beneath years of grief and silence. And as the orchestra began playing once more inside the warm golden light of Blackmere Hall, Elena realized something extraordinary at last. Love had not arrived loudly into their lives. It had arrived quietly, through footsteps in dark corridors, through winter storms, through long silences and careful glances, and the unbearable fear of losing someone before daring to hold them close. Some hearts, she understood now, only learned how to live again when another soul finally refused to let them disappear.